Welcome to the Cincinnati Children's Heritage Video Series. These videos are a project of the Medical Staff Historical Committee. I'm Dr. Elaine Billmeyer. I'm a community pediatrician and I'm a member of the Historical Committee. And with me today is Bea Katz, a longtime employee of marketing and communication. She's the author of a photo history of Cincinnati Children's, which was published on the occasion of its 125th anniversary. So today our topic is the ongoing history of the field of neonatology at Children's. We had a previous interview where we traced the development of the specialty up through the 70s, kind of into the early 80s. And today we're going to pick up where we left off and talk about how the field has really been transformed. So today we have three staff members with us. They are all professors of pediatrics, Dr. Jeff Whitsett, Dr. Jim Greenberg, and Dr. Lou Muglia. And they are the co-directors of the Perinatal Institute. So welcome, thank you for coming. Let's start, if each of you could just briefly tell us when and how you came to Cincinnati Children's, and then we'll take it from there. Jeff, you want to start?
1976.
Okay.
In a U-Haul trailer with my wife, pregnant, and Sarah.
Okay.
And I came really on the aegis of Reggie Sang. Jim Sutherland was the director. Ed Pratt was the chairperson here at that time. And I wanted to come here because it had a great clinical experience. And I'm a Midwest person. And I had an idea that I wanted to do science someday, but I also didn't want to be a physician in which the nurses said, "Oh my gosh, you better save the babies, Dr. Whitsett's coming in to make rounds." So I really wanted really in the trench, good clinical experience, and that's why I came here, 1976.
76,
and have been here
ever since.
42 years.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Jim, how about you?
I joined Cincinnati Children's in 1991. I believe I was Jeff's first external recruit. When Jeff took on the leadership of the Division of Pulmonary Biology. And I had been at the University of Minnesota and had spent time over in England at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge. And when I was in Cambridge, I loved the atmosphere of inquiry and innovation and frankly, being surrounded by people who were way smarter than me. And Jeff, perhaps with some subterfuge in mind, invited me, as I remember, to give a talk here in 1990, which I did, and I went back to Minnesota and remarked to my wife that what seemed to be happening at Cincinnati Children's felt just like Cambridge in terms of this atmosphere of inquiry, innovation, and the notion of a lot of smart people. So when Jeff asked me later on if I'd ever be interested in moving, I said no. And fortunately, my wife said, maybe you ought to think about that a little more deeply. And we were here by June or July of 1991, as I remember, with our, at the time, two preschool-age daughters.
Okay, good. Lou, last but not least?
Yeah, I'm the relative newcomer.
You're the kid.
I'm still in my childhood of being at Cincinnati Children's. I arrived in January of 2012 is when I officially started. And I was originally sort of introduced to the Perinatal Institute in February of 2011 when I came to do one of the Scientific Advisory Council reviews of the Perinatal Institute, which is a little unusual for someone that's a pediatric endocrinologist, which is what my training is, but my area of research is in preventing prematurity, and we've made contributions over the years in that domain. So I had the pleasure of coming for one of the site visits and was just blown away by what I saw from what the Perinatal Institute did in terms of its clinical activities, its research activities, its educational programs, and its interaction with every division here in terms of both supporting them and benefiting from them. So I was impressed, and a couple months later, I got an invitation to come out and look at a position. And it wasn't on the radar screen at the time. I was at Vanderbilt University, which is a wonderful place. But what I saw here was a unique opportunity to impact prematurity by virtue of what Jim and Jeff have put together over the years. It's a unique landscape in pediatrics where they take care of basically every newborn in the region, on the order of 30,000 deliveries. The population informs us of how we're doing, and we can use them as our index of whether we're making advances or not. And so the combination of having the population resource, the great basic science environment, the collegial atmosphere, and then being as part of a really mission-driven program where they set a target on reducing infant mortality as the goal and drive to do that really inspired me to come.
That's terrific, terrific. And we definitely want to come back and talk about that soon. But I'm going to just jump back just because we're talking about history. So when we left off our last history, and I was here as a resident during the mid-'70s, so we had respirators just for preemies, and we had blood gas measurement and temperature monitoring, and like that was the state of the art. But tell us what's happened since then, because there have been a lot of changes.
It's a revolution in care, and we lived through a transition in which most babies with prematurity died. And if they were less than 1,000 grams and had respiratory distress syndrome, they were on ventilators, very poorly managed technically, because the valves and the electronics weren't sufficient, the warmers weren't sophisticated enough, and so we learned hands-on to jerry-rig, and we didn't do it nearly as well as we do it now because of the technology. And we made sequential advances. One, we could feed kids better, give them nutrition that they lacked. We could keep them warm and stable. We could recognize when they were in trouble because we could monitor them now. And we learned and understood basic physiology, cardiac and pulmonary physiology. And that understanding, really basic 1960s science when applied to the babies, made them better and better. Incrementally, everything we did made them better. We got decent at ventilating babies with RDS. They still had terrible lung disease after that. And understanding the molecular basis of surfactant function really revolutionized the therapy and made a very frightening intensive care unit into a quiet place where we could give surfactant replacement, understanding the basic biology and molecular mechanisms by which the lung functions.
Can you tell us a little more about that ordinary human beings would understand?
Yeah, so we had, how did you become interested in this in the first place, and what were the research
My background
steps?
was physical chemistry, and I understood a bit the structure of lipids, and I understood their behavior, and I understood that those lipids would be almost crystalline at body temperature, and we knew that surfactant was primarily those lipids, and it made no sense that they would work like they do. They should be powder and sticking, and instead of making the lungs inflate and deflate very comfortably. So there had to be something in that lipid that made it different than pure lipids that you would get margarine out of your refrigerator. And so we thought that there might be proteins there, and of course we're told there weren't until we discovered them, and those were surfactant proteins B and C, and then we worked with Abbott Laboratories to manufacture preparations based on really work from Adams at Kagami and then Fujiwara in lambs. We found those proteins could protect them and make preparations that you could give back into the trachea, and we routinely do that and have done for the last 25 or 30 years. So that has changed the intensive care unit from a very scary place with machines going day and night to a much quieter and gentler place where we can take care of feeding, nurturing. Babies are much more stable. We rarely put in chest tubes like in the old days because the machines would rupture the baby's lungs. So it changed fundamentally how we deal with premature babies, and it's made it a much more survivable illness or just being born premature.
How long did it take to go from the research, the laboratory research, to the point where it was an approved medication?
It took way too long because we knew it worked, and we had to do double-blind studies to prove to the FDA that it was efficacious. We had to improve the manufacturing, and that didn't take long. And the biggest challenge was getting those clinical studies done when we knew it was life-saving. And those were completed, and it's one of the only drugs ever tested in a double-blind fashion to be an effective medication for preterm babies. Yeah. So it took a long time, 20 years.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was going to say, you want to comment on some of the
just
other
a
changes
couple things.
too?
One, when I was a fellow in the 1980s, I was taught that there were trace amounts of protein in surfactant that were likely to be contaminants or contaminating serum proteins in the recovery process, and that the conundrum, the physical chemistry conundrum that Jeff described was one that was unsolvable, but likely that the solution would reside in understanding exotic lipid structure. I remember this very vividly, and I had just started to become familiar with some of Jeff's work, and so I thought, I think there's more to this story than what I'm being taught in my lectures as a brand new fellow, and certainly when surfactant became a real thing that we could use, it was transformative in how we managed the respiratory distress and failure for preterms. And kind of from a personal perspective, both of our daughters threatened to be delivered early, and I remember thinking about what it would be like if they were born at 25 weeks or 32 weeks even, in an era when we didn't have surfactant. It was a very, very scary thing.
Yeah.
The survival difference is, when I was a resident in New York, you were not allowed to ventilate a 1,000-gram baby. And the attending simply said they all died. You're wasting your time and money, don't do it. And now the mortality for a 1,000-gram baby is probably less than 5%. Something like that.
Really?
So it's been absolutely and it's not just surfactants, it's everything we do. It's everything we learn about taking care of critically ill babies, doing that early adjustment to breathing and to extrauterine life. And making sure they're not asphyxiated. I think the transformative thing for Jim and I with the Perinatal Institute was we had resources and we had an infrastructure, and the problem isn't in the intensive care unit, it's getting into the intensive care unit. And we thought Lou and Lou's program were going to be absolutely transformative, and we had to get our institution thinking about prevention rather than just management. And I think, now I can speak for Jim, his major work is in the community and preventing all the pre-morbid complications that young women or women have in general, to avoid prematurity and to stop it before they get into the intensive care unit. So that's what these two guys have been doing.
So that was our next line of question. Let's jump to it.
Well, maybe I'll just start with a couple comments that kind of harken back to why I came here. So if you think about what Jeff just said about the antecedents of preterm birth and the antecedents of admission into the NICU, they involve women's health really, and how women's health before they become pregnant, as well as while they're pregnant. So most pediatric institutions, I think, would have reacted something like the following if I had said, I really want to dive into prevention of preterm birth and infant mortality reduction, and the way to do it is to really get involved with women's health. The answer would be, well, we're a pediatric institution. We don't really care about it. But I think from the beginning, when I came to Cincinnati, it was one of the many remarkable things about Jeff is that he understood that something I felt was very important, that our patients come from obstetricians, and that the health of our patients is a function of their obstetrical care. And that as opposed to almost every other part of pediatrics where the relationship with general pediatricians and so on is really important, that the key to our success would be relationships with obstetricians and maternal fetal medicine specialists. And those are really the seeds way back in the 90s, actually, that really allowed what we're doing now to flourish. And I think the piece that was really jump-started it as we were getting going, again, kind of in the end of the first decade of the 2000s, was being able to drag Lou away from Vanderbilt, because the mechanistic and intellectual content behind this is really important. The way I put it very simply is that there are lots of non-healthcare, non-biological antecedents, what we call social determinants, that drive neonatal morbidity and mortality. But there's this important thing to remember, and that is that the birth of a baby is still a biological event. And there's certain biological things that have to happen. Contractions and cervical dilatation and rupture of the amniotic membranes and so on. And I think one of the things that's so much fun about being able to work with Lou on a daily basis is that we think about all that together and how it all connects. And I think it gives us a real power, if you will, to solve problems that people keep telling us are unsolvable.
Yeah. You want to chime in on this? Or what's your...
Yeah, I'll just echo a few of the things. I mean, when I was a resident and a fellow, being in the NICU was taking care of extremely preterm babies that usually did not survive because of their lung disease. And the work that Jeff did and others here with him has really transformed that landscape. We've made remarkable progress. It's really been one of the great successes in child health. Having said that, babies don't survive without other problems, though, too. I mean, babies that are preterm don't tend to grow particularly well. They don't have the same neural development as their full-term siblings do. And they can be left with chronic lung issues that we still don't completely understand how to take care of best. And so there still are a lot of babies that die from prematurity. It's the leading cause of infant mortality still. It's the leading cause now of death of children under 5 years of age. And it's now the leading cause of death of children under 5 years of age because we've made more progress in fixing other problems like infectious diseases than we've had in treating prematurity. So why is that? People recognized it for a long time, but we just hadn't made the progress. 50% of all preterm births or more happen for no known reason. Women go into spontaneous labor and delivery, and again, they have a variety of environmental exposures that may contribute to that risk, but there's clearly an underlying biologic risk that women have as well, and we don't understand what that is, and we don't have the answer to the very simple question of what determines the timing for birth in any species. Whether it's a woman or a mouse or a sheep, we just don't know when an animal is due to be born. And what I've tried to do is really focus on that question. And I think Cincinnati Children's is a unique place for someone like me to be able to do that. And it's largely because I can partner with all of the neonatology expertise around clinical programs and around outcomes for neonates that Jim and Jeff have and our faculty has, but allow me to think upstream of that about how we keep people from coming in the front door in the first place. And so what we've come to realize over the last 10 years is that to really make progress in understanding why women go into labor early, we have to study women as opposed to other animal species. And here we have a great landscape for doing that. That's why I was excited about the number of babies we interact with in the region here, our ability to partner with multiple obstetric and maternal fetal medicine programs, and then the institution having the confidence in me to invest in building a program around preventing prematurity. So I think we're going to see changes happening in the next 5 or 10 years. Jim's work with Cradle Cincinnati and his colleagues are absolutely driving home, delivering what we think changes the outcomes for the better now. We know that's probably not going to get us where we want to go, so we have to figure out what really drives the process in the first place. And I think we're just now starting to unravel what the signals are in the mom that tell her when she's going to deliver.
the transformative thing during my stay here, and that's the confidence that understanding fundamental science can be transformed into care. And what was a mystery when you and I trained, is now almost always understandable. We are machines, and we understand the components that make our bodies work. We lack the knowledge that we need to understand prematurity, but we have the confidence that having talented people and teams of people who communicate well and have the enabling technology around you, together you apply that, you can understand very complex things. And someday Lou will solve prematurity, and Jim will solve the disparities in our community and the racial issues that compound morbidity and mortality in our children and in our society. So the confidence that science can uncover truth and then be applied. And Tom Bode understood, so did Bill Schubert. And what transformed Children's from when I came, there were virtually no laboratories in neonatology, or we transformed the men's room into a tissue culture area. But there was a sequential building out of developmental biology, immunobiology, cancer and cell molecular biology, pulmonary and cardiobiology, and together expertise came around those hubs, and the investment was in fusion of basic science and talent, PhD level, MD level, and research assistant, associate level, graduate students, postdocs, building an environment that was enabled by technology that could have concerted focus, marrying science with medicine. And that's what transformed Children's Hospital from a very quiet scientific place when I came. And it was the vision that Bill Schubert had and Tom Bode executed, and our board supporting, that allowed us to build and integrate fundamental science into clinical care.
Yeah, I think it's what I saw when I came here.
That was an
what
attraction.
Bill Schubert hired me, and I remember meeting with him in his office and thinking, this guy's very quiet and kind of sleepy, but I better pay attention.
But he was listening.
I think
But he was listening.
I think I need to really, and I think what that transformation that Jeff described, it was kind of on its exponential upswing when I was wandering around in 1990 already, and certainly has continued to accelerate since then in a really remarkable way.
Yeah, when I looked here in 2012, I mean, it's a scientific powerhouse of an institution. It truly is. Within the Perinatal Institute in neonatology, the science is fantastic, but then you look at developmental biology, reproductive sciences, immunobiology, all of these things we need to really help us do the best science. It's an extraordinary environment.
There's also a fantastic technical revolution they did. It's called molecular biology. And I remember, this is the earliest days of cloning. We made some of the earliest libraries in which you could clone human genes. And Dr. Hutton gave a lecture in which he said, you are all princes, but you really look like toads, and the princess will kiss you. And she's going to do that with molecular biology, and if you don't kiss that princess, you're going to be a toad the rest of your life. And I said, I got it. I hear what you're saying. So there was a revolution.
I think the analogy is bioinformatics right now.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Big data and learning to handle computer science, and the talented people that we need to bring to the table. 23andMe, Lou just had a really fundamental paper in which he's got the genomes of how many people?
43,000.
Right.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, the
So
partnerships we can make. I mean, these things were not possible 5 years ago. We're in a data deluge
we have access to
where
all
we have
this.
access and the ability to analyze it and make sense of it. which is really fantastic, which is why we can study people, because we have these tools, whether it's imaging, whether it's gene expression, or whether it's genetics and genomics that allow us to non-invasively study pregnant women in ways we couldn't do it before.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are we making progress? I mean, you mentioned Cradles Cincinnati. Do you want to talk about what?
I
Can we backtrack and
yeah, I
just
think
explain
it's-
what that is? Because not
okay.
everyone
Sure.
who would see
Well,
this
and I think
video
it's
would
worth
know.
fleshing out some of what Lou just mentioned. I mean, 43,000 genomes plus a validation cohort allowed you to identify relevant genes and relevant pathways to the duration of gestation and the initiation of labor that you could never have identified in humans any other way.
Yeah.
Think about that.
That
I
is-
mean,
that
that's
is
a
amazing.
that's a
That is
big
amazing.
deal, and
Yeah, they're not the things we were thinking about.
right.
They were just-
What are they? Give
Well,
us
there are, so we recently reported 6 regions of mom's genome, her chromosomes, that significantly change the risk for when babies are born. And there are regions that are involved in uterine development and the process of implantation. There's another region involved in control of the micronutrient, the trace metal selenium.
Oh my goodness.
And that's the one I'm most excited about, because we'd never really thought about selenium as a micronutrient important for pregnancy, but it lets you understand how the genetics and genomics might lead you to a non-genetic mechanism for optimizing pregnancy outcomes, because we don't look at selenium levels right now. So we've just been funded to do a big study in the United States and in low and middle income countries to look at how selenium deficiency, not the genetics of selenium, but actually not getting enough in your diet affects pregnancy outcomes. And then, it could be a potential supplementation before or early in pregnancy to optimize outcomes, which would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Put it in the milk, vitamin D.
Yeah,
Selenium.
well,
Yeah.
No more prematurity.
Yeah.
That would be pretty good.
wouldn't that be
It's high in garlic, right? Isn't it?
Garlic?
Garlic, onions,
Another really critical
Brazil
thing.
nuts too.
Is it serious?
The critical, another really major driver is recognizing talent. So I started watching Lou when I reviewed Harvard's endocrinology program, and I was aware of his early paper when he was a fellow, and said, this guy's really good. Someday I'm going to get him here. And
Well,
so
that makes-
and the same with Jim. It doesn't take long, and you realize this is a really talented, self-motivated person who means well and is going to do well. So finding that talent, and then Cincinnati Children's has enabled us, the support of the board and use of our resources allowed us to accrue incredible talent here. We bring wonderful people from all over the world to our laboratories and to clinical care and for training. That talent is what drives our ability to take better care of children. It's talent and enablement, and then being kind.
yeah, well,
No, but a big draw, for I think many of us, is seeing how successful people are at Cincinnati Children's. To have the impact that Jeff's had over the years is extraordinary, and there are other people that have had enormous impact at Cincinnati Children's, and it's an environment that fosters asking questions that will impact human health and making a difference, making sure you get to the point where you're able to do something positive.
it's the Perinatal Institute now. Is that, I mean, how did that particular structure come about? Is that what's driving all this, or?
It's a complex business,
Yeah.
and we had developed relationships with all the local hospitals in the community, complex business negotiations and relationships that have to be built and then maintained, understanding our joint missions in improving children and mothers and families' health. And we have huge academic and complex training programs, interactions with basic science, developmental biology, and pulmonary biology, et cetera. And neonatology interface with every subspecialty of medicine. And so we had to have fluid conversations and have joint missions that brought us together to take care of children. It was our administration needed to understand the complexities that we dealt with, and having a conduit with good leadership, building out some of that leadership, would allow us to have direct conversations, both with the chairperson, so that we could align academic mission and clinical missions with the hospital's missions to run a very complex hospital system. So we report to them, we manage it together. It's very complex. I tend to do more of the science and training. Jim tends to do a lot of the clinical complex negotiations and management. And Lou has developed this wonderful program interacting with OBs and to stop prematurity.
And have you generally had good cooperation with the OBs in town? Was that
That
was there pushback in the beginning, or did
that was Sister Myra and Bill Schubert.
It's an interesting story.
And they simply
okay.
said they were competing, people were fighting over babies. And you might have been in the nursery when some of our local pediatricians had built their own programs and were
Sure.
hiring
Oh, yeah.
independent
Right.
contractors to
Right.
work and
Right.
fragment clinical care.
Right, right.
So Bill simply, and Sister Myra at Good Sam said,
Okay.
Jeff, I need you to solve this. And I said, can I get someone else to solve this? And I couldn't find anyone to solve that. So, all right, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
for 2 or 3 years, we simply said we will now leave just 2 hospitals, Children's and university, and we will
right.
now work throughout the community.
Wow. Yeah.
And that was a huge change in the way neonatologists. We were an ivory tower. We're real
Yeah.
smart. They'll come to us, but we all recognized babies were being born quite safely throughout the community, and everybody needed the support.
They needed the support.
So Bill and Sister Myra were prescient, and they simply said, solve this. And I had lovely people who would help us. There were about 10 or 11 of us, and we just simply started covering the entire city. It took 3 or 4 years to get that settled down, but that's how we built that infrastructure. And it was around what Jim had just said, understanding obstetrical need and the need to have talent at deliveries when there were potential complications. And so we were on the street in night
Yeah.
and day,
Yeah.
and we did that.
Oh, yeah.
And until OBs understood that we meant business, that we really wanted to improve care throughout the community. And that's allowed Jim to work with the hospitals and allowed Cradle Cincinnati to form, and that enables Lou to utilize this wonderful community to figure out how to decrease perinatal mortality.
One thing we've done since being here was given the support to develop something called our Family Preterm Birth Clinic.
Yeah.
And that's actually a partnership with the maternal fetal medicine specialists at both the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and Tri-Health. And we see women that are at high risk for having a preterm infant. Usually that means they've had a previous preterm infant, or it might mean they have a strong family history of having a baby born preterm. But we try to partner with their referring obstetrician to provide them a one-stop consultative service so that they know everything they need to do to minimize the chance of what we are doing right now. So if they need progesterone supplementation, we will provide that. If they're not waiting long enough between pregnancies, we will let them know that. But we try to give them recommendations to optimize their pregnancy outcomes. And now we're actually partnering with the Elm Street Health Clinic to provide those services there, because we think we can reach more of the families that have the highest risk by being out in the community with the obstetrics providers that are seeing them when they're first realizing they're pregnant.
Cincinnati Health Department.
Yeah.
And has this been going on long enough that there are results? You're making
No,
an impact?
we're just transitioning.
Yeah.
We've
Yeah,
been
okay.
doing it here at Children's, and it's hard for families to get here. We've not had the for that kind of problem, consultation when the mom is pregnant and has other kids, and getting to the program
sure,
is
sure.
a challenge.
Yeah.
So we thought there, where they're going for their routine care anyway, we would just see them while they're there.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's just starting now.
Okay.
Can we go back to the Cradle Cincinnati and some of the community outreach and also the work across the state? Because I know that you've been involved in a number of initiatives locally and across Ohio.
Yes. I do want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the clinical program.
Yeah.
if
Okay.
that's
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Because, just a couple of just important comments about how unique our ability to care for babies in the city. I mean, building on what Sister Myra and Bill Schubert were able to do. A couple things. Most academic health centers would have told us not to do this because we're either too smart or we're too, dirtying our hands, so to speak, by taking care of community patients is just a terrible idea because it would distract us from our clinical work or our academic work. Again, in the kind of Cincinnati children's tradition, we were able to say no, that this is actually the right thing to do. And I think with that was a notion that is lost on many academic centers having to do with exporting knowledge. We think of exporting knowledge as publishing papers and maybe patenting our stuff, which is all important, but kind of practical exporting of knowledge meant transferring expertise around how to give surfactant, how to manage respiratory distress in preterms to the community rather than hoarding it all here. And I actually give our leadership in the 1990s a lot of credit for letting us do that and trusting us that the patients who needed to be in our NICU would come to our NICU and that would lead to better outcomes. And at the same time, we'd be supporting the community and the obstetricians in the community who need that support. So I think it's really important to appreciate how special that thinking was. And it was a really, for me, a privilege to be able to act on that thinking.
But sharing the knowledge and not
it's an imperative.
being all in your little pots.
It's an imperative, but it happens too infrequently, frankly. Cradle Cincinnati is a collective impact collaborative that focuses on and has as its mission infant mortality reduction. How did it get started? Well, I think as Jeff and I were thinking about the responsibilities of the Perinatal Institute, there was a lacuna. We had a very robust training mission, a very robust clinical mission, and a very robust research mission that Jeff and Lou have alluded to and described. But we also had this remarkable privilege in that we were caring for all the babies in the region, right? 30,000. So with that privilege comes a responsibility for the population. And the Perinatal Institute was coming into being at the same time that we were experiencing some of the highest infant mortality rates that we had ever seen in this county, and our infant mortality rates were basically the worst in the United States. Right there with some of we were, I think, in the bottom 10 counties in the entire U.S. So that kind of drove home the message that, we can be doing really fancy neonatal intensive care and very fancy developmental biology. And if all of our babies are dying at twice the rate they should be in Hamilton County, shame on us. And that we had that opportunity and that privilege to be able to address that. So of course we, again, in kind of traditional Cincinnati children's fashion, we ran off and decided to do that, and certainly without any formal or official qualifications in public health or epidemiology or any of the traditional disciplines that one might bring to bear, which may have been a good thing. And we spent probably from 2009 until 2012 learning and making mistakes about how best to think about this before we settled on a theoretical framework called collective impact that I mentioned before. And it's not a perfect framework, but it's one that made a lot of sense to us and continues to make a lot of sense to us. And basically, collective impact has several principles. I won't go into all of them, but you can basically think about it as aligning around a goal and using data to draw relevant stakeholders, anybody in this case who cares about infant mortality, who feels that's part of their mission, around the goal of reducing infant mortality that driven by data. And what that means, I guess, in a different sense, is that if my organization's infant mortality rate is low, let's say, on the basis of the clients or people I interact with. But the counties is still high, then I haven't succeeded. And that's hard because organizations tend to want to justify their support,
Yeah, yeah.
their fundraising, and their success on the basis of what they're doing for their folks. So the idea of thinking in a population-based way is really important. And it took, frankly, grassroots evangelizing, for lack of a better term, to say that this is our collective problem and that the only way we can solve it is to work together as a collective impact organization. So that became Cradle Cincinnati. We felt it was very important to have a name, and to have a name that really didn't have a lot to do with Cincinnati Children's. Because while Cincinnati Children's has been a fantastic and fundamental supporter, it really requires that everybody work together. The other health centers, other philanthropic organizations, the corporate sector, and the sector, most importantly, that provides interventions that are relevant to social determinants of health. So Cradle Cincinnati is really all about organizing that herd of cats in a way that keeps everybody focusing on the goal of infant mortality reduction. And we've seen success, and we're excited about that. It's I would say still early success. One of my roles around for the Cradle team is to be the chief grouch and skeptic and to say we're not done and we're not there and I'm not sure that we're really making the kind of impact that we need to yet. But we've seen some really exciting progress.
So who all is part of this? Then?
So there are at least 28 funders, I've lost track, from multiple sectors. And I'm going to screw it up by leaving somebody out, but the key partners include our health departments, the major health centers providing maternity care and women's health services in this region, and other government agencies that are relevant, Jobs and Family Services, which involves WIC and so on. And then at the state level, the Ohio Department of Medicaid, the Ohio Department of Health. We've also received funding from Health Resources Services Administration of the Department of Health and Human Services at the national level. So it kind of reflects the nature of the problem, that there are a lot of different funding sources and a lot of really important partners, and we continue to accumulate more, if you will, as we move forward. We have an advisory board of representatives, decision makers from all these partners who meet on a quarterly basis. We share data at a kind of a summit, for lack of a better term, every year where we reveal the infant mortality rate for the past year.
I hope it's going down.
It is, slowly, and it's important and interesting. I think the first thing we did and recognized the fundamental principle of collective impact has to do with having the kind of data that you need in order to make informed decisions. It's basic, right? You can't do research without data.
Right.
And here we were trying to make decisions about how to intervene around infant mortality by guessing. Or using data that was 2, 3, 4, or even 5 years old. So shame on us. So we spent the first few years of getting Cradle Cincinnati organized around negotiating the kind of data structures that we needed. And for example, vital records. You'd think we collect vital records because you needed to make decisions, right? But don't want to bash the state of Ohio, but they would not want to release vital records information to anyone until they were certain that it was perfect. And that process takes 2 to 3 years. So if this is 2018, we would be getting maybe 2015 data right now. And we convinced them after a while that it was okay, that we were trustworthy enough to use data that was nearly perfect. And that's been a great partnership, and they've been wonderful to work with. So that's an example of how we've moved forward. And as I said, I'm heartened by our progress and motivated by the challenges.
I said, as usual, we have this long list of questions, and you bring up all these exciting things, and we're sort of starting to run out of time. I know you're on tight schedule.
Probably got
So
5 minutes.
we have a little
Talk
time.
too
So give us your Well, what do we need to cover we haven't covered yet? Yeah.
You know, I think, as was brought up by Jim with Cradle Cincinnati, I think one of the things that we do well here is collaborate. We collaborate within the institution, but we collaborate well outside the institution. Mm-hmm. And we're able to partner with organizations to drive the success of programs without having to be the ones that are always recognized as the ones that are in the front and recognize the name. And one example of that, I think, is the March of Dimes Prematurity Research Center that we lead here. It's called the March of Dimes Prematurity Research Center Ohio Collaborative. We're one of 5 prematurity research centers in the United States that's supported by the March of Dimes. And it involves investigators from Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, Nashville, working together in a partnership that is supported by the March of Dimes, but is also invested in by each of the Ohio and Nashville institutions. So it's really been a great model of how you work together as a team to drive this success, to answer the question, and doing what it takes to get there.
Yeah, our teams are changing fundamentally. We're using data that, social service-related data that neonatologists sitting by a ventilator would never think relevant to their daily activities.
That happens after they go home.
The reason that Jim and I were so excited about starting the Perinatal Institute, and we frankly went kicking and screaming into that good moment, was that we had the opportunity to do the things that we've just been talking about, to change the paradigm from an intensive care unit and from a laboratory into discovery of our community, the social networks and the antecedents, whether it's housing, air, pollution, nutrition. They're complex things that we don't understand. And we had the resources, and now they were going to let us pursue that and invest time and money in the infrastructure that Jim and Lou have thought would be fundamental for really taking on these unanswerable questions. Surfactant was unanswerable in 1960. It was not understood, it was mysterious, and once you understand the fundamental molecular basis of it, it's just common sense. Of course it works. But that will be someday how we understand our communities and how we understand our DNA.
That is an exciting.
It's really an exciting time in science and medicine. The other is, children do so much better than they used to. It's a great story in pediatrics. When I was a resident here, leukemia, you die 50% of the time. Now, if we lose a child to leukemia, 1 or 2% of children, 98% survive, and they live happily ever after.
I said, my old practice used to take care of all these preemies, and I'm thinking, where did they go? Where did they go?
Right.
They're still
heart disease.
Yeah,
if you had tetralogy of Fallot and needed surgery in the first 2 weeks, half of those children died. Perinatal infant mortality from that disease is less than 0.1 or 2% surgically, and if it's more than that, what went wrong? So it's a transformed world. Gastroschisis. You and I took care of omphalocele gastroschisis. They go home now.
It's just amazing.
So the world of pediatrics has been transformed by understanding the systems of care, of having talent, and having the time and energy to apply science to medicine.
That's great. No.
Thank you all. It's always way more fascinating than I even think it's going to be. So,
Thanks
I know
for
you're all
shepherding us.
busy.
Thanks,
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming.